Abandoned his wife and 5 children. 40 years later he kneels after finding out they are millionaires. James sat motionless in the dimly lit room, the only light coming from an old oil lamp casting shadows on the peeling walls. The room reeked of dampness and cheap liquor. In one hand, he held a half-empty bottle of alcohol, while the other clutched an old photograph. In the picture, Clara, his ex-wife, was holding their youngest child, David, with the gentle smile James had once loved. But now, that image only filled him with bitterness. "What have I done with my life?" James murmured, his voice faint and slurred from the alcohol. Rare tears streamed down his gaunt face, reflecting the collapse of a man who was once full of ambition. The past surged back like a nightmare. James had once been a promising engineer at a small factory in the city. But his ambition for wealth made him forget the value of family. When the factory faced financial difficulties, he chose to abandon everything and run after Lucia, a wealthy and alluring woman. At the time, James thought he'd found his golden opportunity. But Lucia was not the partner he had dreamed of. After a few years together, she began to exploit him, using him as a tool to fulfill her own desires before coldly leaving him when she no longer had a need for him. "Lucia," James muttered, a bitter laugh escaping him as he recalled the day she disappeared with the last of his possessions. It was then James realized he had nothing left. No money, no career, and above all, no family. A cold wind seeped through the broken window, causing the tattered curtain to flutter. James pulled his coat tighter around him, but the chill in his heart seemed impossible to shake. He raised the bottle, intending to take another sip, but his trembling hand caused it to fall to the floor. The spilled liquid spread across the floor like his life chaotic and meaningless. The door to the room suddenly opened, startling James. It was his neighbor, Roberto, an elderly man with a bushy white beard and stern eyes. "James, drinking again? Have you thought about turning your life around?" Roberto stepped inside, his voice a mix of irritation and pity. James let out a hollow laugh, not bothering to respond. Roberto looked around the room, his gaze stopping at the photo of Clara on the table. He sighed deeply. "Clara didn't deserve what you did to her. You destroyed her life and your children's too." Roberto shook his head, unable to hide his disdain. "You know, people in the neighborhood still talk about your family. Clara did everything to raise 5 kids without a penny from you." James was speechless. Roberto's words cut deep like a knife. Though many years had passed, every mention of Clara and the children still weighed heavily on his guilt-ridden heart. "You think I don't know that?" James snapped, his voice hoarse. "I wasn't a good father. But I can't go back now. It's too late for everything." Roberto silently regarded James. Finally, he said, "Maybe you're right. But sometimes, what matters most isn't going back, it's trying to make amends." After Roberto left, James slumped back into his chair. He looked around the squalid room and was suddenly disgusted with himself. Images of Clara and the children filled his mind again, like a movie on repeat. He remembered the day he left. Clara had cried, begging him to stay, but James turned his back, never looking back. At the time, he was only thinking of his new life with Lucia, believing he deserved something better. But now, James realized the price of his selfish ambition was loneliness and regret. "Clara. The kids." James whispered, as though the names might bring him some comfort. But all he found was a void of hopelessness. Outside, rain began to fall, and the wind howled through the cracks in the door, creating a mournful melody. James wondered if somewhere, Clara and the children were living well, or if they were also suffering because of the hardships he had caused. In his drunken stupor, James dreamed of his family. He saw Clara pulling a wooden cart under cold rain, her frail hands trembling with exhaustion. He saw Matthew, their eldest son, clutching an old, torn book, his eyes filled with sadness after being humiliated by his teacher. Sophia, the frail daughter, skipping meals to save food for her younger siblings. Andrew, Isabel, and David, each child appeared in James's mind, as if reminding him of the inescapable truth. When he awoke, James found himself lying on the floor, the empty bottle rolling beside him. The faint light from the window signaled the start of a new day, but for him, nothing had changed. James sat up, staring at his old, weary face reflected in the cracked mirror. He wondered if he had the courage to face the people he had abandoned. In stark contrast to James's loneliness and despair, Clara was struggling to keep her family afloat in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city. The torrential rain showed no signs of stopping, water seeping through the rotted roof and dripping onto the cold, muddy floor. Clara hunched over, pushing a wooden cart laden with wet firewood, her hands numb from the cold. Her gaunt face and dark-circled eyes betrayed years of exhaustion, but there was no trace of surrender. "Ma, take a break. Let me push it." Matthew, her eldest son, hurried to grab the handles of the cart. His calloused hands were already familiar with hard labor. Clara shook her head, trying to muster a smile. "I'm fine, son. I'm used to it. You go home and check on your siblings." Matthew bit his lip, his eyes filled with helplessness. He knew his mother was exhausted but still tried to appear strong for her children. Matthew also understood that since their father left, she had become the sole pillar of their family. In the ramshackle house, Sophia was crouched by the fireplace, trying to ignite the damp firewood Andrew had just brought in. Smoke billowed, making her cough, but she persisted, fanning the flames. Isabel sat in a corner, clutching a tattered doll with tears welling in her eyes. "Matthew and Ma have been gone a long time," Isabel whispered. David, the youngest, said nothing, quietly picking up scraps of paper from old boxes and stacking them neatly for firewood when the logs ran out. Andrew entered, carrying a small bundle of firewood, his face streaked with mud. He kept his head down, avoiding Sophia's gaze. "You went into the forest again, didn't you?" Sophia asked, her tone accusatory. "You know they'll beat you, but you still go." Andrew clutched the bundle tighter, his voice trembling. "If I don't, how will we cook dinner?" Sophia said nothing more. The house fell silent. The sound of rain hammering on the roof was a relentless reminder of their harsh reality. Clara returned, soaked to the bone. Matthew followed behind her, equally drenched. She placed the bundle of firewood in the corner of the kitchen, panting heavily. Looking around the house, Clara bit her lip to hold back her tears. "Sophia, have you started cooking?" "Yes, Ma. I'm making porridge, but there's not much rice, so it's very thin." Clara nodded. She opened the old cupboard, searching for the last bit of salt, then quietly walked over to Isabel, stroking her daughter's hair. "Are you hungry, Isabel?" Isabel nodded softly, her eyes brimming with tears. Clara pulled her daughter into her arms, her voice choked with emotion. "Just hold on a little longer, sweetie. The porridge is almost ready." Matthew slumped onto the floor, watching his mother and siblings. His fists clenched tightly, a fire of anger burning inside him. He was furious at his father for abandoning the family and at himself for not being old enough to help his mother more. "Mom, I'm going to quit school and start working," Matthew suddenly declared. Clara was startled and turned to look at her son. "No. You need to stay in school. That's the only way you can change your life. But how can you keep carrying all this on your own? I can't just sit by and watch you suffer." Matthew argued, his voice trembling as his eyes filled with tears. Clara remained silent. She knew her son was right, but she didn't want her children to sacrifice their future because of their current hardships. "Just hold on a little longer, Matthew. When I can't go on anymore, I'll let you know. But for now, you have to stay in school." Matthew lowered his head, hiding his frustration and anguish. That night, the family fell asleep under the biting cold. Clara tossed and turned, unable to sleep. She looked at her children curled up under thin blankets, her heart breaking. She thought of the days when James was still around. Though they had been poor, at least she hadn't faced the struggle of survival alone. Now, everything weighed on her frail shoulders. Outside, the wind howled relentlessly. The shadows of trees danced, casting strange shapes on the walls. But none of it was as terrifying as the constant worry about how to make ends meet the next day. The following morning, as Clara prepared to head to the market to look for work, she was stopped by her neighbor, Mrs. Carmen. "Clara, I heard James is living in the old district near the train station," Mrs. Carmen said, her tone laced with gossip. Clara froze. News of James felt like a knife stabbing her heart. But she maintained her composure, nodding before walking away. "Don't even think about it, Mom. Someone like him isn't worth mentioning," Matthew said sharply, having overheard the conversation. Clara didn't respond, only tightened the shawl around her shoulders. She knew her son was right, but somewhere deep inside, there was still a twinge of pain. She didn't want James to return, but thinking about her children growing up without a father made her heart ache. James sat quietly by the dusty window, his hollow eyes staring into the gray void outside. A faint light from the narrow street outside illuminated his gaunt face, emphasizing the deep wrinkles carved by years of regret and guilt. In his hands was the worn photograph of Clara and their children, its edges frayed from being gripped too tightly too many times. He sighed deeply, placing the photo down on the table. His trembling hand reached for the bottle of alcohol but stopped halfway. James was disgusted with himself. The alcohol no longer dulled the pain of his past, it only made his despair more unbearable. "They've probably forgotten me by now," James whispered, his voice fading into the cold, empty room. But deep down, James knew it wasn't that simple. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that everything was in the past, memories of Clara and the children lingered, haunting him every night. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's disappointed gaze and the image of his children, hungry and cold in their impoverished home. "I shouldn't have left," he murmured, his voice heavy with regret. Outside, the rain fell heavily, the relentless downpour hammering against the ground. The sound of the rain seemed like an unending curse, tapping a mournful rhythm on the rickety roof. James pulled his old sweater tighter around him, trying to ward off the chill that seeped into his bones. The door creaked open suddenly, startling James. It was Roberto, the only neighbor who occasionally stopped by. He held an old coat in his hands. "James, it's freezing out." "Take this," Roberto said, placing the coat on the chair. His gaze held a mix of pity and reproach. James glanced at the coat, then at Roberto, saying nothing. Roberto sighed, looking around the cluttered, dismal room. "You can't keep living like this. You need to do something, at least try to make up for what you've done," Roberto said firmly. James let out a hollow laugh. "Make up for it? How? Clara will never forgive me. My kids probably don't even want to see me." Roberto remained silent for a moment before replying slowly, "Maybe you're right. But if you don't try, you'll never know." With that, Roberto turned and left, leaving James alone with his thoughts. He sat there, staring into the void. Roberto's words echoed in his mind. Suddenly, memories of his early days after leaving his family came rushing back. Lucia had promised him a life of luxury and comfort. But reality had been far from his expectations. Lucia was cold and calculating, and James had been nothing more than a tool for her personal gain. When she abandoned him, he was left with nothing but empty hands. "I have no one left, nothing left," James muttered. The thought of his family consumed him more and more. Back at Clara's small house, Matthew returned after a long, grueling day working at a hotel. His shirt was covered in dust and grime, and exhaustion was evident in his eyes. Clara looked at her son, her heart aching. "Eat something, Matthew," Clara said, handing him a bowl of thin porridge. Matthew took it and nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to eat. "Mom, the people at the hotel look down on me. They know I'm poor, and I feel ashamed," Matthew said, his voice breaking. Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. "Do you remember what I've told you? Being poor is not a crime. As long as you hold on to your dignity, no one has the right to look down on you." Matthew clenched his fists. His mother's words were true, but he couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. In the corner of the room, Sophia had just returned from her night shift at a small hospital. She sat by the fire, tiredly rubbing her cracked hands. Andrew was focused on fixing an old computer, their most valuable possession and his only tool for pursuing his dream of starting a business. Isabel sat quietly, mending an old shirt with focused determination. David carefully counted coins he had collected from scavenging bottles and cans. Clara looked at her children, a wave of love and sorrow washing over her. She knew they had grown up amidst hardships, enduring judgment from neighbors. But she had never let them bow to adversity. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. Clara walked over and opened it. It was Mrs. Carmen again, her expression curious. "Clara, I heard James is still alive." "He's near the train station," Mrs. Carmen said, her words light but cutting like a dagger into Clara's heart. Clara froze for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "That has nothing to do with me anymore." Mrs. Carmen shrugged and walked away. But her words were like a stone thrown into a still pond, stirring up waves in Clara's heart. That night, Clara lay awake, restless. Memories of James flooded back. The image of the man who had once been her pillar, the father of her children, was now nothing more than a faded shadow. Does he even remember the children? Clara wondered aloud, then shook her head. No, he chose to leave us. James sat silently at the old wooden table, his tired eyes staring into the void. On the table lay the family photograph, alongside an empty bottle of cheap liquor. James sighed, his heart heavy. He rubbed his face, feeling the deep wrinkles etched into his dry, weathered skin. The sleepless nights stretched on. James often dreamed of Clara, of the little children who used to cling to him, chirping "Papa" in their sweet voices. But in those dreams, their faces were blurred, their eyes full of reproach. He would wake up drenched in sweat, feeling as though he had just escaped a nightmare only to realize that reality was far crueler than the dreams. A sudden knock on the door broke the silence. Startled, James slowly stood up. Opening the door, he found a middle-aged man with a haggard face standing before him. "James, it's me, Martine. Do you remember me?" the man asked in a low voice. James squinted, trying to recall, then shook his head. "I don't remember." "Who are you?" Martine gave a faint smile. "We used to work together at the lumber mill. I heard you moved back here, so I thought I'd check on you." James nodded slightly and invited him in. The cramped room felt even smaller with another person in it. Martine glanced around, his eyes betraying a hint of pity. "You're living like this?" Martine asked softly, unable to hide his concern. James shrugged. "What other choice do I have?" Martine was silent for a moment before speaking slowly. "I've run into Clara a few times at the market. She's as strong as ever." James froze, his heart tightening. Hearing Clara's name from someone else's lips always brought him pain. He wanted to ask more but couldn't bring himself to. Martine stood up, preparing to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and turned back. "James, people make mistakes. But no one's stopping you from making amends. Don't wait until it's too late." The door closed behind him, leaving James alone with his turbulent thoughts. He stood there for a long moment, then slowly turned back to the table, his eyes resting on the family photograph. At Clara's small house, Matthew sat wearily at the old desk. Under the dim glow of a yellow light, he was engrossed in an old book, its pages yellowed with age. Clara quietly approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. Matthew, it's late. You should rest, she said softly. Matthew looked up, his eyes still tired but filled with determination. I want to study a little more, Mom. I don't want to keep doing manual labor my whole life. Clara gave him a sad smile. She understood her son's aspirations but also noticed the calluses on his hands from overwork. Your health is more important, son. Don't push yourself too hard. Matthew nodded slightly but couldn't shake the heaviness in his heart. He recalled the disdainful looks from wealthy customers at the hotel. Their mocking words and sneers echoed in his mind. In the corner of the room, Andrew was busy repairing an old computer. His hands were smeared with grease, and his eyes remained fixed on the screen. Andrew, aren't you going to sleep? Isabel asked timidly. I need to finish this. Tomorrow, I'm presenting my business plan to Luis. If it's good, I might get funding to start a small company, Andrew replied, his voice filled with hope. Isabel beamed, her eyes sparkling. I believe you can do it. Clara stood quietly in the corner, watching her children. Despite the hardships they faced, she felt immense pride in their unwavering efforts. Sophia returned from her shift at the small hospital, her face pale with exhaustion. She placed her bag on the table and sighed deeply. Mom, the hospital cut my hours again. My paycheck won't be enough, she said, her voice heavy. Clara sighed but said nothing. She understood how much harder life was becoming, but she refused to let herself fall apart. David entered silently, carrying a few plastic bottles and empty beer cans. He placed them in the corner, avoiding his mother's gaze. Clara noticed and felt her heart tighten. David, why are you doing this? She asked gently. David lowered his head, murmuring, I just want to help you. Clara pulled her youngest into her arms, tears streaming down her face. The night deepened, and the family fell asleep. Only Clara remained awake. She thought of James, the man who had once been her husband and the father of her children. Did he ever think of them? Or had he truly forgotten this family? In the cold, dark silence, Clara whispered, no matter what, I won't let my children fall. James wandered aimlessly through the old streets, his tired feet dragging with each step. The dim yellow streetlights cast long shadows on the rain-soaked pavement. He pulled the collar of his thin coat higher, but it did little to keep out the biting wind. The old, silent houses mirrored his own life ruined and desolate. The lively chatter and laughter from a small bar caught James's attention. He paused and looked through the foggy window, seeing middle-aged men gathered, raising glasses, and talking animatedly. A pang of sadness hit him as he realized he once had friends like that, once enjoyed such nights. Now, all of it was a distant memory. He turned away, muttering to himself, no one needs me anymore. James's steps led him to a small park near the train station, where he used to take his children to play on weekends. The familiar bench was still there, now covered in moss. James sat down, his vacant eyes staring into the distance. He thought of Matthew, his eldest, who used to cling to him, begging him to teach him how to ride a bike. He remembered Sophia with her wide, curious eyes, sitting in his lap, listening to his stories. Andrew, the stubborn one, always trying to get his father's attention. Isabel, the little girl who never let go of his hand. And David, the youngest, always calling him Papa, in his sweet, lisping voice. Now, James had no idea how they were doing. Thinking about it, he let out a hollow laugh. Maybe they've forgotten me by now. The rustling sound startled him. A haggard-looking man approached, carrying a paper bag in his hand. Are you sleeping out here too? The man asked in a deep, rough voice. James nodded. I just don't want to go home. The man sat down on the bench and opened the paper bag, pulling out an old loaf of bread. My name's Ernesto. I used to be a mechanic, but the company went bankrupt, and now I wander from place to place. James looked at Ernesto and replied bitterly, I used to have a family, but I threw it all away myself. Ernesto chewed on the dry bread silently. After a moment, he spoke slowly, everyone makes mistakes. But not everyone has the courage to fix them. James lowered his head, his heart heavy. Those simple words felt like a knife twisting in his chest. At Clara's small home, Matthew sat in silence at the old wooden table. He had made up his mind to quit school and work full-time at the hotel. He knew it would upset his mother, but he couldn't bear to see her struggle any longer. "What are you planning to do, Matthew?" Clara asked, her voice tired. Matthew clenched his fists. "I'm going to ask for more hours at the hotel. I can't let you keep carrying all of this on your own." Clara shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. "You're still young, and your future is ahead of you. I don't want you to sacrifice your dreams because of our circumstances." "Mom, I don't want to see you wear yourself out anymore," Matthew said firmly. Clara pulled her son into an embrace, her tears falling onto his shoulder. Standing in the corner, Sophia turned away, unable to hide her own sorrow. Meanwhile, Andrew sat in front of the old computer, his eyes fixed on the screen. Lines of error codes sprawled across it, and he scratched his head in frustration. "Is it broken again?" David asked timidly. Andrew sighed. "I don't know. If I can't fix this, my startup plan will fall apart." David said nothing, quietly placing a glass of water next to his brother before walking away. Andrew watched him leave, a deep sense of helplessness welling up inside. In another corner, Isabel sat sewing an old sweater. Her small hands trembled from the cold, but she kept working diligently. Sophia watched her younger sister, her heart aching. "Mom, maybe I should take on more shifts at the hospital." "I can work more night shifts," Sophia suggested. Clara quickly shook her head. "No, Sophia. Your health is more important. I don't want you to suffer any more than you already do." The house fell into silence. Each family member carried their own worries, but no one dared to voice them aloud. Late at night, Clara sat alone by the fire, her gaze distant. She thought back to the happy days with James. Despite their poverty, their home had been filled with laughter. Now, only a heavy silence remained. She clenched her frail hands and told herself, "No matter what, I have to stay strong. For my children." In the dead of night, James sat huddled by the window, silently watching the heavy raindrops hit the cold pavement outside. The dim streetlight cast a faint glow on his wrinkled, weary face. In the quiet room, the only sounds were the ticking of an old clock and the wind whistling through the broken window. James shivered. He had never felt so empty inside. His trembling hands reached for the old family photo, his fingers tracing the familiar faces. Clara stood in the center, her gentle smile seeming to dispel all hardships. Beside her were the children, Matthew, Sophia, Andrew, Isabel, and David. Each of them had eyes full of innocence and hope. But now, those hopeful eyes existed only in his memories. Memories he had tried so hard to bury. Closing his eyes, he vividly recalled the day he left. Clara stood there, her eyes red but without begging. She silently held their children close, saying nothing. That silence now echoed louder in his mind than any words of reproach ever could. James slumped over the table, his shoulders shaking under the weight of his regret. He had destroyed his family with his selfishness and blind ambition. A knock at the door pulled James out of his thoughts. Slowly, he stood up and opened it. Standing there was Ernesto, the drifter he had met the night before. "Drinking again?" Ernesto asked, frowning at the empty bottle on the table. James didn't respond, silently turning back into the room. Ernesto stepped inside and handed him a bag of bread. "Eat. You need a clear head to think straight," Ernesto said. James accepted the bag with a small nod. Ernesto sat down, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about what you told me last night, about your family," Ernesto said slowly. "Have you ever thought about trying to find them?" James let out a bitter laugh. Find them? And what? Let them look at me with disgust. Ernesto was quiet for a moment. Maybe they'll be angry. Maybe they won't forgive you. But at the very least, you have to try. If you don't, you'll live the rest of your life with this regret. James remained silent. Ernesto's words touched a deeply buried fear. He was terrified of facing the truth, of seeing the cold, distant eyes of his children. Ernesto stood up and patted James on the shoulder. Think about it. Don't wait until it's too late. After Ernesto left, James sat in a daze. The images of Clara and the children flickered through his mind. He closed his eyes, imagining their lives now. Matthew must be an adult by now. Sophia might have become a young woman. Andrew, Isabel, and David, he wondered how much they had grown. Were they happy? Or were they still struggling with hardship? At Clara's house, Matthew pushed open the old wooden door and stepped inside, his face heavy with fatigue. His clothes were soaked from the rain. Why didn't you wear a raincoat? Clara rushed over, grabbing a towel to dry his hair. Matthew shook his head, his eyes weary. I forgot. Mom, I quit school. Clara froze, dropping the towel. She looked him straight in the eye. What did you say? Matthew took a deep breath. I quit school. I'm going to work full-time at the hotel. I can't let you keep struggling like this. Clara's voice caught in her throat, tears welling up. She clenched her hands tightly, her voice trembling. Matthew, I've told you before. Education is the only way for you to escape poverty. Don't you think I know that? Matthew shouted, his voice full of anguish. But I can't stand watching you waste away day by day. The house fell silent. Matthew's siblings lowered their heads quietly. Sophia stood by the stove, tears falling onto her hands. Andrew clenched his fists tightly, his eyes filled with frustration. You don't need to sacrifice your future for me, Clara said softly but firmly. If anyone has to bear the burden, it's me, not you. Matthew lowered his head, his fists still clenched. He knew his mother was right, but his heart remained heavy. Outside, the rain continued to fall relentlessly. David quietly opened the back door and stepped out. He walked to the night market, where people gathered to collect recyclables. David bent down, picking up each empty beer can, his small hands turning purple from the cold. An older man noticed him and approached. Kid, why are you wandering around at this hour? David was startled and clutched his bag of recyclables tightly. I'm just picking up some things. The man looked at him, his expression softening. What's your name? David. The man sighed gently. Go home, kid. It's too cold out here. David lowered his head and turned to leave. His small figure gradually disappeared into the rain. Back at home, Clara sat deep in thought. She could feel the weight of her children's struggles pressing down on her shoulders. But she didn't know what else she could do. Her eyes drifted unconsciously to an old photograph on the shelf, a family picture from better days. Where are you, James? Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. No matter what, I still wish you could see how our children have grown. Years passed. One dreary morning, James woke up in his empty room, just like every other day. Pale light filtered through the cracks in the window, highlighting the layers of dust covering the old furniture. He sluggishly got up and looked around the room. Suddenly, a knock at the door shattered the familiar silence. Mr. James. A mailman stood at the door, holding a gilded golden envelope. Yes, that's me. James frowned as he took the envelope, feeling a mix of surprise and suspicion. Who would send something so luxurious to him? James closed the door and examined the envelope, trying to find something familiar. There was no return address, only gold embossed lettering, Mr. James is cordially invited to a gratitude ceremony at the Grand Palace Hotel on May 15 at 6 p.m. James read the letter over and over, his eyes filled with confusion. A mistake, perhaps. Someone like me, who would have any reason to thank me? He shook his head, laughing bitterly. Yet, despite his doubts, he couldn't stop the curiosity that crept into his mind. All day, the invitation consumed his thoughts. What if it's a joke? But, what do I have left to lose? When May 15 arrived, James dressed in the tiddiest clothes he owned, though his coat was worn, and his shoes were old and tattered. He looked at himself in the mirror, the wrinkled face and tired eyes staring back at him reflected the uncertainty in his heart. This will be the last time I let myself hope for something unrealistic, he muttered, leaving his room with heavy steps. The Grand Palace Hotel loomed before him, a symbol of opulence and grandeur, starkly contrasting the world he lived in. The gleaming glass doors reflected the golden lights within. Luxury cars lined the entrance, and elegantly dressed guests walked past him without so much as a glance. James felt out of place. He stepped inside the grand lobby, where priceless paintings and crystal chandeliers created an air of magnificence. The receptionist glanced at him, her eyes betraying a flicker of pity as she took in his attire. Still, she remained polite and guided him to the event hall. Please, go inside. The ceremony will begin shortly. James walked through the large doors, squinting against the bright stage lights. The room was filled with round tables adorned with exquisite settings, and guests engaged in lively conversations in their elegant attire. A sense of inadequacy gnawed at him. I don't belong here. He chose a secluded corner at the back of the room and sat quietly. A server brought him a glass of water and asked if he wanted any food, but James only shook his head. What kind of joke is this? James whispered, his gaze wandering around the room. Before he could think further, the lights dimmed, leaving only the stage illuminated. A voice echoed through the speakers, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's gratitude ceremony honoring the remarkable individuals who have contributed to our success. Tonight, we not only celebrate achievements but also pay tribute to the silent sacrifices made along the way." James looked toward the stage, straining to recognize the figures stepping forward, but the bright lights obscured his view. Applause erupted across the room. The host continued, "Before introducing our honored guests, let us watch a short video about their incredible journey." The large screen lit up, showing the faces of individuals one by one. James watched intently, and his heart stopped when a familiar face appeared: Matthew, his eldest son. In the video, Matthew wore a sharp suit, standing in front of a grand hotel bearing the name Matthew International. "Matthew, is that you?" James whispered, gripping the edge of his chair. The video continued, introducing others. Sophia appeared in a surgical suite, wearing glasses and a mask, with the caption, "Renowned International Surgeon." Andrew was shown next, his bright eyes standing out as he worked in a sleek office with the logo of a leading tech company behind him. Isabel appeared on a fashion runway, surrounded by models wearing her stunning designs. Finally, David was seen at a major press conference, signing contracts with high-profile business leaders. James couldn't speak. He stared at the screen, overwhelmed. "These are my children." The video ended to thunderous applause. The host returned to the stage, smiling brightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, these extraordinary individuals have achieved unimaginable success. Tonight, they wish to honor a great woman who sacrificed everything to raise them, Mrs. Clara." James froze. Every emotion inside him seemed to explode at once, and he realized the full weight of his absence in their journey. Clara had raised their children to become remarkable people while he had wallowed in weakness and regret. The applause roared throughout the hall, but James could only hear the pounding of his own heart. He sat motionless, his eyes wide, fixed on the stage where his 5 children stood. They were poised, accomplished, and radiant under the spotlight. James's hands gripped the chair tightly as a wave of disbelief and guilt swept over him. The host continued. Let us introduce Matthew, the founder and CEO of the international hotel chain Matthew International. Matthew stepped forward, wearing an elegant suit with a calm, confident smile. James's eyes were glued to his eldest son. Matthew, is that really you? Grown up so much, he murmured, hardly believing his eyes. Next, we have Sophia, a leading surgeon in the field of medicine, who has saved thousands of lives worldwide. Sophia walked up, exuding confidence, yet her gentle eyes were a perfect reflection of Clara's from years ago. James felt a pang in his chest. Andrew, founder and CEO of a pioneering artificial intelligence company. Andrew, the once mischievous boy, was now a successful entrepreneur. James stared at his son, astonished, pride mingling with regret. Isabel, a renowned fashion designer whose collections have graced the world's top runways. Isabel stepped out, poised and sharp. James felt disoriented seeing his daughter now as a strong, independent woman so different from the shy little girl he remembered. And finally, David, a young financial investor who has closed multi-million-dollar deals and supported hundreds of startups. David, the youngest who once toddled around clumsily, was now a confident, accomplished man. James could no longer hold back his emotions, his eyes brimmed with tears. The host smiled warmly. These achievements are not just the result of personal effort but also the quiet sacrifices of an extraordinary woman. A mother who single-handedly raised and nurtured them. Please, everyone, give a round of applause to honor Mrs. Clara. At that moment, a large portrait of Clara appeared on the screen. It was an image of her smiling gently, her eyes filled with love and resilience. James choked up, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. Matthew stepped up to the podium, his voice resonating through the hall. We stand here today because of our mother Clara, the woman who gave her entire life to raise us. She worked tirelessly, endured countless hardships, and never once complained. He paused, his eyes filled with sorrow. We have never forgotten those cold rainy days when she pulled a cart of firewood, or the sleepless nights she spent worrying about our meals and shelter. She was our silent hero, teaching us the values of perseverance and kindness. The hall fell silent. The only sound was James's labored breathing as every word struck him like a dagger to the heart. Matthew continued, his voice softening. But today, beyond honoring our mother, we also remind ourselves that no one is perfect. Everyone makes mistakes, and everyone deserves a chance to make amends. James clenched his fists, his heart pounding wildly. His entire body trembled. An overwhelming urge surged within him, he couldn't stay still any longer. The applause snapped him back to reality. James stood up and took heavy steps toward the stage. Guests turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. James didn't care. He kept his eyes fixed on his children. Matthew glanced down, his eyes briefly widening in surprise at the sight of the frail, elderly man approaching. Sophia frowned, Andrew and Isabel exchanged puzzled looks, and David raised an eyebrow. James stopped in front of the stage. His voice was hoarse, trembling but resolute. It's your father." A stunned silence fell over the room. All eyes turned toward James. His children froze in place. Matthew was the first to speak, his voice cold. "What are you doing here?" James stammered, tears threatening to spill. I don't deserve it. I know. But I want to apologize. To each of you." No one responded. The tension in the room was suffocating. Sophia clenched her fists, her eyes red. Andrew looked down, avoiding James's gaze. Isabel gripped David's hand tightly, while David stood motionless, his face unreadable. James dropped to his knees, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. So very wrong. I abandoned your mother, I abandoned you all. I can't turn back time. But I beg you, please, give me a chance to make up for even a fraction of my mistakes." Matthew stared at James for a long moment, his eyes conflicted. Finally, he let out a deep sigh. "You can't change the past. But, if Mom were here, she wouldn't want you to live in regret forever." Sophia nodded, tears streaming down her face. Andrew whispered softly. "Mom taught us to forgive." Isabel turned away, her voice quiet. "But you're no longer our father." David stepped forward, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "But we won't leave you alone. We can't call you father, but you can be part of our lives, if you truly want to change." James broke down in tears. He hadn't dared to hope for more. Just standing there, facing his children, and being granted forgiveness even partially was the greatest gift he could have received. The applause that followed was not loud but resonant, like a quiet acknowledgement. On the large screen, Clara's portrait remained, her gentle smile a poignant reminder that forgiveness is the most priceless gift. The atmosphere in the hall grew solemn, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for an emotional release. James remained kneeling below the stage, his shoulders shaking with raw emotion. Tears streamed down his face, mingling with heavy breaths. Clara's image on the screen seemed to radiate, a symbol of irreplaceable love and strength in her children's hearts. Matthew was the first to speak again, his voice slow but firm. "You abandoned my mother during the hardest years of her life. She had to fight poverty and raise us on her own." James hung his head, silent. He knew any excuse now would be meaningless. Matthew paused for a moment, his cold gaze softening. "But my mother always said, everyone makes mistakes, but the important thing is to rise and make amends. We won't call you father, but we will give you a chance to become part of our lives." Sophia wiped a tear from her cheek and added gently. "Mom wouldn't want you to live in regret forever. But we'll need time to accept this." Andrew stood silently, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he nodded gently. "We can't forget, but we can learn to forgive." Isabel turned away, but her voice rang out, choked with emotion. "Mom sacrificed her entire life. If she were still alive, she wouldn't turn away from someone who truly regrets. But you have to prove you're worthy." David stepped forward and helped James to his feet. His eyes, no longer cold, now carried compassion. "We don't need words. We need actions." James was helped to his feet by his children. His hands trembled, but his eyes shone with deep gratitude. He dared not hope for anything more. Just standing before his children and being given a chance, however small, was the most precious gift of all. Applause filled the hall, slow but filled with emotion. The attendees were visibly moved by this extraordinary moment. Matthew turned back to the crowd, his voice strong and resonant. "Today is not only a day to honor my mother but also a day for us to recognize the value of forgiveness. And I would like to pay tribute to the greatest woman of our lives, Clara." At that moment, a large curtain behind the stage slowly rose, revealing a gigantic portrait of Clara. It depicted her holding her children close, her kind smile and loving eyes radiating warmth. Beneath the portrait, golden letters read, "The greatest mother, Clara." The room erupted into applause. James gazed at the portrait, his heart filled with regret and pride. Tears streamed down his face once more, but this time, they were tears of release. Matthew continued. "We have prepared a small gift to honor our mother. Starting today, the Matthew International Hotel chain will dedicate a fund to support struggling single mothers, named the Clara Fund." The applause grew louder, more vigorous. James felt the warmth spreading through the room. He realized Clara was not only the mother of their children but also a symbol of strength and compassion for the community. After the ceremony, the guests gradually left, leaving the space quiet for the family. James stood silently, watching his children, his heart heavy yet brimming with hope. Matthew approached him, his voice calm. "You will live with us, but don't think of this as a reunion. This is your chance to prove you deserve it. James nodded softly, his voice trembling. I won't disappoint you. Sophia added gently. You'll need time to adjust. And so will we. Isabel smiled faintly, though still a bit reserved. Start with something small. Maybe take care of the garden at home. James chuckled through his tears, a soft, relieved laugh as though a heavy burden had been lifted. Andrew, standing nearby, said quietly. And don't forget to visit Mom. David placed a hand on James's shoulder, his voice warm. We'll take you to her resting place. She deserves to know. The next day, James and his children visited Clara's grave. A bouquet of pure white flowers was placed gently before her headstone. James knelt, his trembling hands brushing against the engraved name of the woman he had once loved but lost. Clara. I'm sorry, James's voice cracked. I made you endure so much. But look at our children, they've grown, haven't they? They're more incredible than I ever imagined. I don't deserve it, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Matthew stood silently behind him. Sophia held Isabel's hand, Andrew bowed his head, and David closed his eyes. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying petals through the air as if in response. Perhaps Clara had already forgiven him. Months later, James lived with his children in their spacious yet warm home. He spent his days tending the garden, fixing broken items, and helping with the smallest tasks. No longer their father in title, James became a companion, quietly supporting his children. One afternoon, while trimming the garden's hedges, Matthew approached him, his tone softer than before. Would you like to join the Clara Fund? We need someone to manage assistance for struggling families. James looked up, surprised but also filled with joy. I'd be honored. Matthew nodded slightly, addressing him as Father, for the first time, not out of obligation, but with genuine warmth. James felt the sincerity in that single word. The sky that day was a brilliant blue. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it a sense of Clara's presence, embracing the family in her warmth. James's story is a profound lesson about the value of family, forgiveness, and the opportunity for redemption. Though he once lost everything to selfish ambition, James was fortunate to be given a chance by his children to rebuild his life. It reminds us that no mistake is too great if met with genuine remorse and a commitment to change. Most importantly, it teaches us to cherish family and never let mistakes cause us to lose those we love.